Welcome. My name is Tony Arend, and this is SFS Online and On Topic. This webinar program brings distinguished members of the Georgetown faculty and alumni community together to talk about the most critical issues of our day. It is produced by the Georgetown University Alumni Association in collaboration with the Walsh School of Foreign Service. And today we have a very, very important topic and an amazing guest expert. We're going to be talking about Putin's war in Ukraine and the fight for his legacy. And to help us through this topic, we have one of the world's leading experts on Russia, East Europe, and an expert on the old Soviet Union back in the day when there was the old Soviet Union, Professor Angela Stent. Professor Stent is my friend and colleague. She is a professor emerita of government, and I would notice emerita meaning officially retired. She retired, and then Putin decides to invade Ukraine, so she's been busier now than she ever was before. She has served at Georgetown for over 30 years. She was director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies, also known as CERES. She served on the National Intelligence Council. She has advised the U.S. government in a number of other circumstances and situations. She has written numerous books, including her most recent book, Putin's World. And I would note she updated it in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine, and a paperback version came out earlier this year. So if you haven't bought Putin's World, you got to buy Putin's World. Now, we're going to launch right in, and I'm going to turn to Professor Stent and say, what's going on in Ukraine right now, and how do you see this ending?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me on your show. I've known Professor Arend since he first came to the government department in Georgetown, so it's a long friendship and colleagues for a long time. So what you have now in Ukraine is, I would say, a military stalemate. The Ukrainians began their counteroffensive a few months ago, and it's been very challenging because in the previous months and year, really, the Russians used the time to build up mining. They've laid mines all over the territory of Ukraine, and they're very sophisticated mines, and they operate also in cyberspace. So it's been very difficult for the Ukrainians to take back the amount of territory that they've tried to take back. They've incrementally taken back, a few square miles a day, but the Russians have done that too. So it looks as if it's stalemated. I think what people expect is that, winter will come, it'll be more difficult to continue the fight, that the Ukrainians will resume their counteroffensive in the spring. But that, of course, assumes that they're going to have the weapons they need, and I know that we're going to be talking about that later. But what Putin himself is doing is he is sitting out and he's waiting till January 2025, when he hopes that either President Trump or someone who shares his views on not supporting Ukraine will be in office, and when the Europeans, will decide that they can no longer go on providing as much assistance and as many weapons to Ukraine, everyone will be war weary. So that, I would say, is Putin's game plan. It's very hard to see how this conflict ends. It's very hard to see how Ukraine takes back all of the territory that Russia has taken really since 2014, because that would include Crimea, and certainly since February of 2022. And in the absence of that, there would probably have to be some kind of negotiated settlement. But we're nowhere near that now. The Ukrainians certainly would not accept the current Russian terms, which are that they have to recognize 4 territories that the Russians claim to have annexed, even though Russia doesn't control all of the territory in any of those republics, including the 2 in the Donbass. So it's very hard to see any Ukrainian leader accepting that, because they'd be out of office. So then the question would be, who would be willing to accept what? What would the Russians be willing to accept? And that's why, there are people obviously in this country and other places who are calling that the US should pressure Ukraine to sit down now with the Russians, but the Russians don't even want to do that. And I think the final point to make is Putin has made it clear from the beginning that taking over Ukraine, kind of reincorporating it into Russia in some sense, was just part one of a broader series of goals that he has, which is to recreate a Slavic union with Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and northern Kazakhstan. But then if you listen to some of the things that Russian commentators are saying, and Putin indirectly, it's to move further, to take back quote unquote historic Russian lands. And of course, if you go back to the 18th century, that includes parts of Poland. So that's where we are now.
Well, parts of Poland, because I'm at least I'm gonna raise that, because when we look at either parts of Poland or Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia, we're talking about members of NATO, and we're talking about crossing a threshold that he hasn't crossed before. Do you think he would reasonably want to do that, or do you think that the NATO security alliance is tight enough that he would know that he can't do that?
Well, so far what we've seen in this war is that, in fact, it does matter if you're a member of NATO. So Putin, the Russians haven't really attacked, the trains, the convoys that are taking weapons from Poland in to Ukraine, and they've harassed the Romanians. In some of their bombing of Black Sea facilities have actually hit some towns in Romania, but the Romanians have taken this in a rather deliberately low-key fashion, so as not to have to invoke, that we're actually being attacked by Russia. So I think you can say until now that NATO membership is something that guarantees that countries are not going to be attacked by Russia. That's saying that now. I mean, I guess, Putin does have these dreams, and maybe at some future time, he or a successor might think that NATO would weaken, or they might be willing, even though they clearly haven't done that so far, to use something like a tactical nuclear weapon to just make their way further west. I don't think that's likely, and I don't think Putin taking over parts of Poland is likely either. But that's certainly, I think what we have to remember is that Putin has an agenda. He may not be able to fulfill it. That's broader than just Ukraine.
Well, it's interesting with respect to NATO, because we've seen a very different approach with the last two American presidents. So President Biden has made it very clear that he's a believer in the NATO alliance and strengthening the NATO alliance in his work to do that. President Trump, at least at one point, was calling into question the efficacy of NATO. And I remember, particularly with respect to Montenegro, he said in so many words, would we be concerned if there were an attack on Montenegro? So do you think perhaps it goes to your point about 2025? Do you think perhaps he's sort of thinking about what might be the constellation of power in the United States?
Because, yeah, we do know, as you said, and it's in John Bolton's memoirs, that Trump really did want to withdraw the US from NATO, but he didn't. And it's also not, as you know well, it's not that easy to do it. It's Congress has to get involved too. But that's, I think, what Putin is hoping for, that you will have a Donald Trump in the White House who will slowly, pull the United States out of NATO. And in that case, a purely European NATO, it's going to be very hard just to survive like that. So again, from Putin's point of view, maybe there won't be NATO in 6 or 7 years.
And I mean, I think that may be part of his calculus.
Yeah.
Maybe there won't be Putin in 6 or 7 years. I want to raise a question, because I was in the midst of running an international relations program for high school students when all of a sudden Prigozhin and members of the Wagner group launched this march to Moscow, which didn't make it to Moscow. And of course, Prigozhin soon found himself no longer in this world. What was that? What was the Wagner revolt about, and what are we to make of that? And how do we interpret whether that means that Putin is still strong, or is he weakened?
Yeah, so we were, of course, all transfixed in those 24 hours from June 23rd to 24th with this mutiny. And a lot of people thought this really means that the system is much less stable than we thought. I mean, what you can say about Prigozhin is he had made himself into a kind of a larger than life and quite charismatic figure. And he paid his Wagner fighters more than the regular army soldiers are being paid in Russia, and they had privileges. And then he was a populist. I mean, his message in the weeks before this mutiny to anyone who wanted to watch him on his Telegram channel was, you know, your sons and brothers and husbands are ill-equipped. They're dying on the front. They're not given enough food, you know, and the horrible circumstances. But the sons of and husbands of the elite, where are they? Oh, they're in the south of France, you know, sipping cocktails. This was in the summer. So he did have that appeal that I'm a man of the people. He comes from humble origins. He was a petty hooligan. He was jailed when he was a teenager. You know, I'm just like you. I'm not like one of these fancy oligarchs with, you know, lots of money. I mean, he was pretty rich too, but that's not how he presented himself. So he had this appeal. And so when his troops got to Rostov and they took over the base there, you remember all the people came out in the streets, they gave them food, they clapped them. And on their way to Moscow, they also had support. I think what must have happened was that he didn't really have a fully fledged plan. His immediate demand, by the way, was because the Russian Ministry of Defense, and of course he hated the Minister of Defense and the Chief of the General Staff, they were demanding that all the Wagner soldiers sign up with the regular Russian military and that Wagner kind of disband itself. And that's, you know, he was pushing up back against that. But, you know, and he got quite far toward Moscow, but then presumably he realized that there wasn't really a backup plan and who was going to meet him. We know that General Surovikin, who's now being demoted, did support him and did also was part of the negotiating process when he finally turned back and went back. But I think what it shows is that there is popular discontent about the way that the war is being fought in Russia, not necessarily opposition to the war, but about the way that these, you know, young men are being treated by the Russian army. And that there are some in the military who clearly share that view, but not enough of them apparently to carry out a successful coup. And then, of course, after that, you were told, yes, well, all the Wagner people are going to go to Belarus. Well, they were there for about 1 minute. I mean, they were there for a couple of weeks. And the other thing is then Prigozhin shows up in Africa, right? So even though I see this mainly as a military mutiny, it's also involved business dealings. The Wagner group was making lots of money in the Central African Republic and other countries in the Sahel, owning mines, gold mines, diamonds, you know, training the security forces there, special relationships with the leaders. And some of that money did go back to the Kremlin. And Putin himself, you know, alluded to that when he made his TV speech. But we think that there were also maybe people who had business disputes with him. And then, of course, we know he's in Africa, he goes back to Russia, and then the next day his plane falls out of the sky. Now, since then, and even before that, I think Putin used this as an opportunity to consolidate his power, because Shoigu and Gerasimov, the defense minister and the chief of the general staff, the ones whom Prigozhin demanded that Putin get rid of, they're still in office. Nothing's really changed there. A few other generals have been dismissed. There has been, you know, a mild shakeup in the armed forces, but everything is more or less in place. And Putin, you know, he uses a combination of repression, of appealing to Russians' kind of patriotism of blasting the West for everything. And even though it was just 40 days since Prigozhin's death, which in the Russian Orthodox religion is when you know, commemorates a special day, and people showed up in the cemetery at his grave. And I've seen videos of people saying, we're going to take our revenge. I think that's probably unlikely. Wagner is slowly being dismantled, although it's still active in Africa. And so I think Putin has emerged from this at least as strong as he was before.
Oh, that's fascinating. And you're right. We were all, well, all of us that were following this carefully were really glued to the TV to wonder, like, where is this going? And it was something that nobody had anticipated. Let me shift a little bit. We talked about NATO, and the one thing that I have observed is that the American response and the NATO response following the invasion really brought NATO together. We saw the kind of consolidation that we hadn't really seen, and I think that was heartening to many. But but not every country in the world responded that way. And matter of fact, there was a UN General Assembly resolution which condemned the action, and I think there were like 140 some states that voted to condemn, but there are 193 members of the UN.
Right.
There were a lot of states that did not vote to condemn the Russian invasion. So what do we make of this sort of mixed response of non-Western or non-NATO related states?
Yeah. So I think what we've seen happening is that a large number of countries, in what we would call the global South, but there should be a better name for it, have decided they're not going to take sides in this war. India, all the BRICS countries, right? All of them abstain. So India, Brazil, obviously China, South Africa abstained. And for many of these countries, they look upon this as a kind of European war. It doesn't affect them. Of course, it does affect them in terms of the grain exports and fertilizer exports. But anyway, this is a European conflict. Many of these countries are skeptical, to put it mildly, of the United States. They view the United States still as a kind of, a colonial or an ex-colonial power, and they do not view what Russia's doing to Ukraine as colonialism, which, if you look at it objectively, it is, but that's not how they see it. And a number of them have, important economic relationships with Russia. Now, Russia can't offer any of these countries what the US can economically. And particularly in the Indian case, they will admit that Russia can't give them the development assistance they need. But let's say in the Indian case, India is Russia's largest purchaser of arms and weapons. This is historic. India and the Soviet Union had historic ties. Russia's the only country that supports India's position on Kashmir in the United Nations. And even though those arms exports are diminishing, they're still important for India. Same with oil. India has benefited from what's happened since the war began by getting a lot of cheap Russian oil. And the Indians want the Russians to somehow act as a balancer between them and China. Brazil, again, they import a lot of their fertilizer from Russia. South Africa. So I've been involved in a project where we've actually been having conversations with experts in some of these countries about the war. And what the South Africans will say is, for the African National Congress, the Soviet Union supported the anti-apartheid struggle, the United States didn't. And many of these, the ANC, they're fighters, they were trained in the Soviet Union, and they still, let me turn this off. Sorry, this is the...
That is the emergency broadcast test that everybody's phone was supposed to be. I turned my phone off, but at least we know it works, Angela.
Right. Well, my phone was on mute, but anyway, I've turned it off. So, and so they have historic links. And then, interestingly enough, both in South Africa and Mexico, we talked to the Mexicans, they somehow view Russia as the heir to the Soviet Union, and that somehow it's a socialist country. And if you try and point out to these, no, Russia isn't a socialist country. It has a very harsh form of capitalism. Anyway, so I think it's history, and then it's Russian disinformation. I have to say, in Latin America, RT and Espanol is the most popular now medium that people follow, the Spanish-speaking people at least in Latin America. And the Russians have done a very good job of presenting their narrative about who's responsible for the war, the United States and NATO, and getting people to support their position. And I do think that that's something the US has to do better with. So, and then I think the final point to make, I guess a few weeks ago, CIA Director Bill Burns talked about the hedging middle, middle powers who now see this war as an opportunity to give themselves, to have more agency in the international system, to be more important. I mean, the Brazilians said, we see this as an opportunity to make Brazil listen to more. And so they're taking this advantage of this. So it's not as if they're non-aligned, they're just basically unaligned. They don't want to be aligned, and they want to have, they want to be flexible. And so for all of those reasons, even though the US has tried to, persuade some of these countries that they should really rethink what they're doing, I think that they will remain neutral, and they certainly won't jump on the sanctions bandwagon, nor will they criticize Russia.
So that's fascinating. And I mean, I think the references to Russian disinformation are also fascinating. I hadn't realized about RT and Espanol being a big big thing. But that's something very interesting. I know we probably have some people who are listening to us from parts of Latin America.
Yeah.
Let me ask one more question, then we're going to get to questions from our viewers. And this relates, so there's one country we've only mentioned, but nonetheless plays a huge role, and that's China. How is China interpreting the war? How are they responding? How do you see them sort of playing out their policy going forward?
So I think without his belief in China's support, Putin wouldn't have launched this war. When he was in Beijing a couple of weeks before the war began, as far as we know, he didn't explicitly tell Xi Jinping exactly what the nature of the conflict was going to be. But I think probably the Chinese believed, as many other people did around the world, that what Russia was trying to do was to maybe consolidate its power in the Donbass, take a little more territory. But since Russia began this war, the Chinese obviously haven't condemned Russia. They have, to a large extent, not broken the sanctions because their economic, relations with Europe and the United States and our Asian allies are much more important than with Russia. But we do know that some things are getting through from China, and certainly they're supplying the Russians with all kinds of technology which they can't get anymore from the West. They have completely parroted the Russian narrative about the war, that NATO provoked Russia, that Putin was provoked. They've said absolutely nothing critical about that. They've never commented, obviously, on all the atrocities that we know that have been committed during this war. The one place where they have been more or less explicit is to warn Putin against using nuclear weapons. The Chinese do not want the Russians to, detonate a tactical nuclear weapon. This is not what they would approve of. And they do have their own peace plan, although it's really a rather vague peace plan. But they have, their envoy has visited Kyiv as well as Moscow, and then a number of European capitals. But I think the thing we have to remember is the Chinese do not want Russia to lose this war, because Russia is China's partner in, making the world safe for authoritarianism and supporting China in what it does. And their nightmare, and then we can go back to Henry Kissinger in the early 1970s, their nightmare would be a Russian leader coming to power, presumably in the wake of a defeat, who then rethought Russia's commitments and thought, well, maybe we should really mend fences with the West. Seems very hard for us to imagine that, but that is one of the things I think that the Chinese fear. So they are more or less tacitly supporting the Russians. They did send an envoy to the Jeddah conference, where they did discuss different peace plans. So they still are present at those meetings, but they're really doing nothing, to advance a peace. And some people think that for them, if the war goes on longer, that's fine. Russia has become increasingly dependent on China because of the war, and that suits the Chinese well.
Do you think China is drawing any lessons with respect to Taiwan from the American/NATO response to the invasion?
So, I'm not a China expert. I think what the lessons you could draw is how valiantly the Ukrainians have fought back. So the question of they're fighting for their independence, really, the Ukrainians, and that's obviously what the Taiwanese would be fighting for, and therefore the morale would be very high. We know that the morale among the Russians isn't very high because they're really not completely clear what they're fighting for. And I don't know how well indoctrinated the people in the PLA would be in terms of, is this the right cause? So I would think it would make the Chinese think about this, but my friends who are China experts say it wouldn't necessarily deter them from trying to take back Taiwan if they really want to.
We'll have to bring in Victor Cha and ask him that question in detail as well. We're going to get to questions. I would ask people to please put questions in the question box. I don't see any there right now. So I would ask people to please go ahead and write your questions in there. As that's happening, I'm going to ask you another question. So in the United States, we have had some tumultuous political developments, and I think I'm understating the case. How does Putin look at these things, I mean, and I mean, you could even elaborate, because we were talking earlier about how people in Europe, how is this fitting into his calculus, or is it fitting into his calculus, aside from his immediate calculus about the election for the presidency in 2024?
Right. So I think this fits into his calculation also about the presidency. I mean, the more they, they believe that U.S. resolve will weaken. Well, it's probably weakened earlier than they thought it would. I think watching the chaos in, in our own Congress, it also feeds into the Russian narrative is, you want democracy? Is that what you want? Chaos? We have a well-run functioning state. We don't have things like that happen here. So I think for them, they're just watching this play out. They're obviously very happy about it. The evening talk show hosts in Russia, who outdo each other to be very hawkish, they keep playing scenes of this, explaining to their readers how chaotic the United States is. And they have just started syndicating a Tucker Carlson show, apparently without his permission, but still, he's another of their heroes. So, official Russia, is pro-Trump and pro all of the MAGA Republicans who want to improve ties with Russia and who want to stop supporting Ukraine. And in general, the more chaos there is, the better. And I think we do seriously have to worry, and I think there was a piece in the papers about that yesterday, coming up to our own election next year, Russian disinformation, it's not only in Latin America. There's a lot of it here. Russia trying to interfere, maybe in different ways than it did in 2016, but trying to interfere in our own electoral process.
So thank you. Yes. And we're still trying to figure out things here ourselves. So yeah. Dr. Bill Liccamelli, who is an alum of Georgetown, a longtime professor at Georgetown University Medical Center, asks, now he's the doctor, but he asks if you might have an opinion on Putin's health. There's various rumors that circulate. I don't know if you have a view on that.
Yeah, Dr. Liccamelli was also in an online class I taught for GU retirees a couple of years ago.
Excellent.
I don't really have too much of a view on Putin's health. I mean, again, we've had Director Burns at Georgetown last year talking about this, and he said, as far as they could see in the CIA, he seems to be in reasonably good health. When you look at him, because he's had all of this, whatever it is, Botox or whatever he does, plastic surgery, his face looks a little strange. It looks very different than it did 10 years ago. But he doesn't look particularly sick. I know people sometimes focus on if he's sitting down, his hands or feet maybe are trembling a bit, and there were, rumors about Parkinson's. But I think it's, and I know that he has on occasion had a bad back and things like that. But I think nobody really knows, obviously, what's going on with his health. But he seems to be, for someone who's, I guess, this weekend turned 71, he seems to be in reasonably good physical health. Now, as to his mental state, I think that's another question. I think that people who know him, and this is all very indirect, say that he really does now have this kind of messianic complex, that he believes it's his destiny, to bring the Ukrainians back into the fold and maybe to take over other parts of the historic Russian Empire. And I think he also apparently really believes that Russia is, the harbinger or the savior of traditional Christianity and traditional values against, the woke West and woke Ukraine. So that may be going on inside his head, but I think physically, as far as one knows, there isn't anything major wrong with him.
The messianic complex is interesting, because I've heard so many over the years say he sort of sees himself as not just rehabilitating the Soviet Union, but being the new Peter the Great, and trying to return to that period. Well, I have another question from Brooke Marriott, and this really relates to the succession, and that is, Putin may be healthy and maybe 71. I'm going to predict that he's not going to live forever. I could be wrong. But I'm going to predict. I'm going to go on the record. I'm going to predict that. What does it look like? Do we have any any way to conceptualize what the succession process would look like, who his obvious successors might be, or how that might play itself out, or we just don't have enough information?
I mean, Putin has been very careful not to be a lame duck. And every time there's a rumor, oh, maybe this governor would be a successor, that kind of fades away. If something happened to Putin tomorrow, immediately the prime minister would take power for, I think, 3 months. And the prime minister, Mishustin, is one of these technocrats. You know, he was known in the business world before he became prime minister, but wasn't generally known. And as far as we know, I mean, obviously he has accepted that there's a war going on, and he's tried to do his best to insulate the economy from the worst impacts of the sanctions. But we don't know very much more about his beliefs, but also he doesn't really have a base. So he probably wouldn't be. And then if there were an election, you know, in three months' time, I mean, he probably wouldn't be the candidate. You know, Putin has his inner circle. Again, they're more or less in his demographic. So, you know, they're older. There's the former Prime Minister Kiriyenko, who is younger. And he started off as someone, he was running their nuclear energy institutions. And he started off with, you know, being a kind of pragmatic, you know, engineering-oriented person. But by now, he's become very ideological, and he spends a lot of time in the Donbass. So if he were, he is a possible successor, but it's not clear that his ideas would be very different from those of Putin. And beyond that, you know, there are a couple of other governors. There's the former president, Dmitry Medvedev, who, of course, was in power when Obama was, and we knew him as the kind of Western-looking, new generation, modern Russian. Well, since this war has broken out, he's become the real attack dog. He posts, you know, very aggressive things on social media. He says he's the one who talks about, you know, dropping nuclear weapons on different European countries and things like that. I don't really think he is a contender for power. But so I'm not coming up with very many names because it's an opaque system when we don't know very much.
Yeah, you know, it reminds me of the old days when the Kremlinologists were trying to watch who was standing next to whom and figuring
exactly
what some things never change. So I've got a question from Jeremy Bell, and this really relates to corruption issues. Now, over the years, there have been some concerns that the Ukrainian government was a corrupt system, that there were contractors, that people in the government were getting paid bribes and the like. And so obviously the United States is contributing financially and also providing weapons assistance and the like to Ukraine. Is there any indication that you would have that either US funds or US weapons are somehow being mishandled, or there are continuing corruption problems that are sort of impeding Ukraine's war effort and perhaps, you know, misusing US funds?
So Ukraine obviously had a deserved reputation before this war broke out for corruption and for wide-scale corruption. I mean, there's corruption in Russia too, plenty of it, but Ukraine, I think, had a particular reputation for that. What we've seen since the war broke out is, you know, the US has been very firm in telling Zelensky and his colleagues that they really do have to get to grips with this. And there has been progress. I mean, there is an anti-corruption organization that works. Zelensky has fired a number of top people, including his defense minister recently.
Right.
Exactly, because of corruption. In that case, people who are bribing their way to get out of serving in the armed forces. So it's still going on, but when you talk to people in this country, they feel that, you know, Zelensky has made an effort and some of it is being dealt with. Have some of the weapons gone astray? I'm sure they have. There are, you know, but when people in the Congress, opponents of this, say, well, we have no idea what's happening. I mean, we do have bodies out there, international ones, US ones, European ones, that are watching this and that are trying to make sure that most of the money and the weapons go to where they're supposed to go. So yes, it's a continuing challenge. but I think it's, it has somewhat improved. And my impression is that there isn't any kind of large scale kind of disappearance of weapons or money into the wrong hands.
Well, that's good. That's a good assessment. Another question that's been raised by William Collins relates to the expat community, the Russian expat community. And as we all know, when the war broke out, a lot of people fled Russia to the West and to various other places. And of course, we have a large Russian expat community in the United States. Have they played a role? William Collins is asking, maybe they haven't been as outspoken as they might be against Russia. Do you see that as a factor, or maybe even comment on what role you think they've played?
Yeah, so about 1 million Russians have left Russia since the war began. A few 100,000 of those were people who mainly didn't want to be drafted. But you do have a significant expat population in places like Armenia and Georgia, in the Baltic states. Berlin has many of them, London, and of course in the United States too. Some of them have been very outspoken. I mean, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the tycoon who was jailed for 10 years and then Putin let out, he has a whole organization that's, already trying to figure out what a democratic Russian government would look like. They're thinking to the future, but they're also very critical of what's going on. Alexei Navalny, who of course remains in solitary confinement in a very harsh penal colony, his people are all out, the rest of them, or mostly, and they live in different parts of Europe and the US. And they certainly are very active also in speaking out. And there are a number of other anti-war groups who are active in speaking out. One of the things that's unfortunate is, as in most of Russian history, the kind of democratic opposition groups find it very hard to work together. They are often at each other's throats. They're often competing with each other. So that the people who follow Mikhail Khodorkovsky don't talk to the people who follow Alexei Navalny's organization and other things like that. So we don't have a unified vision here. And then some of the other Russians who have come out are not outspoken. It could be because they have family in Russia. And if they have family in Russia, those family members, could be harassed. And it may be just that they're, concerned about their own safety. We know that the Russians don't hesitate to reach outside of Russia if they want to persecute opponents. So you have a lot of people who are out now and who are thinking about, what Russia should look like in a post-Putin system, and who oppose the war and who send money to the Ukrainians. I see that, just one of the recent Nobel laureates this week has said that he's going to donate his portion of his prize to the Ukrainians. But they don't speak with one voice.
That makes good sense. One question that sort of connects to the exodus also relates to the demographic changes in Russia. How do you see the demographics of Russia moving over the next decade or so, and do you think that's going to affect either the future of this conflict or sort of the future of the possibility of a democratic regime in Russia?
Yeah, so I mean, the demographics are not good. Russia's population has been shrinking for years, and it's particularly shrinking among the Slavic population. The ethnic Muslims, they're still having lots of children, and then some of the other minorities. So one of the things that the Russians have done in the past is to use Central Asian labor, and now Central Asian migrants who it then conscripts into the military, and they fight. But there's another aspect to that, and that is, again, the differential between the Slavic and the non-Slavic population. The Russians have been drafting disproportionately non-Slavic ethnicities, the Buryats, Chechens, people in the North Caucasus. The Buryats are an Asian ethnic group. And they're not only being drafted in disproportionately large numbers, but dying in largely disproportionate numbers. And so you've seen some unrest among some of the minority ethnic groups there about what they see as racism in this war. And so that also feeds into the kind of demographic picture. So it will be, going forward, irrespective of the war, it's going to be difficult for Russia to maintain what it has unless it can reverse the population decline. And Putin has offered financial incentives for women to have lots of children. The Russian Orthodox Church is very much bringing back the traditional view that women should stay at home, they shouldn't work, and they should have large families. And the Russians, they're trying to move with the Orthodox Church to outlaw abortion and even pills too. That might sound familiar to some people who are on this call, but so they're trying to do everything they can to increase their population, or particularly their Slavic population, but I don't think they've had too many results yet.
So I'm going to ask what I think will be the final question. I want to thank all our viewers for asking some great questions. So you mentioned this, and this is going to be an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So thus far, we have had the awarding of the Nobel in medicine. We have had the awarding of the Nobel in physics and the awarding of the Nobel in chemistry, which came earlier this morning. Tomorrow is the Nobel Prize in Literature, and then Friday is the Nobel Peace Prize. And I actually did a little bit of research on this, and I found that there's betting on all these things. I mean, I guess people will bet on anything, but there is gambling taking place. I'm shocked on who's going to get the Nobel in peace. And last time I saw, the #1 choice was Zelensky. What do you think? Is that a realistic choice? I mean, there's a war going on right now that Volodymyr Zelensky might be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize right now.
Yeah, I mean, it is a paradox to think that someone who is, leading his country in a war, admittedly a war where they were attacked, they didn't initiate the war, would be awarded a peace prize. But you remember when President Obama came in, right? And he was awarded the prize, and he hadn't done very much yet. So sometimes I think sometimes these prizes maybe are also kind of aspirational. I mean, the last couple of years, who have they honored? Well, the Russian editor and the Philippine journalist, the journalists who haven't been afraid to speak out against the government. So I think it would be paradoxical. I didn't realize that Zelensky was the #1 favorite, at least in the betting world. So I'm definitely going to watch out for that.
Well, it was interesting. I looked at this a couple days ago, so I'll have to look at it again. Also, among the top candidates was the World Health Organization, which I don't, given the pandemic, I don't know that they've acquitted themselves really well to get that award. But maybe it's prospective. Well, what could happen? Well, we have literally 2 minutes left. Angela, final words of wisdom you would want to impart about Russia, Ukraine, or Putin's world?
So I would say, I have to come back to the US. I would say you have to watch the US Congress, because if the assistance for Ukraine never makes it back into any bills, then that will have really disastrous consequences for Ukraine. It'll probably affect what the Europeans say, and Putin there'll be a big grin over his face. That's what I'm going to say.
Well, and all I can say is time will tell. Time will tell if we have a Speaker of the House soon, and time will tell if I don't know, 38 days from now we can avoid another government shutdown, and time will tell whether we will be able to get through Congress a bill providing assistance to Ukraine. So we will all have to stand with bated breath on that. Angela, I want to thank you as always for sharing your wisdom and insights. We always appreciate it. And I want to thank all our viewers out there, many of them Georgetown alums and supporters of Georgetown. Special shout out to Kelly Young of the Georgetown University Alumni Association for making sure that our microphones worked and this program actually happened. I will look forward to seeing many of you next month. We're going to be talking about artificial intelligence, and Andrew Embry, who did his PhD with us in the government department, who is an expert on artificial intelligence, will be our guest. So Angela, thank you. Thanks everyone out there, and we will see all of you next time on SFS Online and On Topic.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it, Tony.
Bye, Angela.
Bye.